And where did you get that shirt from that you're wearing?
I can't remember. I think I got it in a thrift, either in a Vinnie's in Bondi Junction or in a thrift store in LA. Like, what's that? Atwater Village. I think maybe there. Yeah.
Well,
what about yours?
Let's talk about shirts a bit more. I'd just like to welcome everybody to the podcast, another episode of Tell Me Where I'm Going Wrong. It's a podcast where two exes who are still really good friends talk about life, love, politics, secondhand clothing, Lady Gaga, pop culture, and everything in between. I'm Sean, and that's Josh. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hi, Sean. Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm enjoying this heat wave that we're having in London.
It's funny, isn't it?
26 degrees, I think, at the moment, and that's Celsius or centigrade.
My phone says 25 now.
25. So what's that in Fahrenheit? That'd be about 78, maybe?
It's kind of wild for April/May, isn't it, to be this warm?
It is the last day of April when we're recording, and yeah, it is unusual for it to be this warm this early on. So,
and the forecast says that it might be 26 tomorrow again.
Well, we had 26 today, so I think it might be.
Well, it says
even
25
warmer
on mine, but it's so lovely. But I've been trying to explain to Hill lately about how hot it is in Brisbane, because when we visited, like the only time that he's been to Brisbane was, I think it was around, what time of year was it? March? Which is, is that?
That's the end of summer. That's still pretty hot.
Like autumn, right? Isn't it?
I feel like summer goes right through until like April, and then it gets cooler in Brisbane.
But I can remember it, it's still being 30 degrees or 28 degrees, 30 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, oh, it's very hot. And I said, yeah, but this is nothing. This isn't even anything compared to what it's like. And so here last night in our flat, I had the window open and the breeze wasn't, it wasn't hot, but there was like a nice breeze coming through. And I said, oh, this reminds me of like Brisbane, when you just always have the windows open, unless you've got air conditioning, but you have the windows open, you enjoy just the fresh air coming in, you get a bit of a sea breeze or a river breeze. And I really enjoy that. Like, you spend so much of your time in London or the UK with everything shut, don't you?
I'm going to say I think you're romanticizing it in your memory, because I remember many nights in Brisbane where there was no breeze, and we would curse the fact that they built Brisbane inland from the coast. Like, they didn't build it on the coast, they built it inland. And so, like, yeah, if you're right on the river, you might get a bit of a breeze, but otherwise I can remember nights where it was just like so hot and humid and still. And I think we've mentioned it on the pod before, like we would get like face cloths, face towels, and flannels, is that what we call them in this country? Flannels. And we would wet them and like roll them up, like just squeeze them a little bit so there was still a lot of water in it, and then put them in the freezer. And then you would just wake up periodically throughout the night, because none of the places we lived at ever had air conditioning.
No, so everywhere that I've been looking at, because I've been looking at places in Brisbane with thinking about the idea of moving back there and seeing what's available.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the places, I think all of the places I've looked at have air conditioning.
Oh, that's good. I mean, that's good, because I mean, you need it in a hot climate like that. But yeah, you would wake up periodically through the night dripping in sweat, and you would like, stumble into the kitchen, just reach into the freezer and pull out some like frozen ball, and then like shove it under your arms and in your crotch. And like just try and cool down. It was just I think
when I was younger, I definitely couldn't afford, or there wasn't a prevalence of air conditioning in Brisbane, and right up until my early 20s, and I moved out of home when I was 15 or something, and lived all over. We couldn't afford anywhere with, let alone air conditioning. We didn't even have insulation. Like, do you remember that place in Harcourt Street in New Farm where we lived with Monique and Drew?
Oh my God, it was like a furnace.
Tin roof rusted. It was a tin roof with no insulation, and the walls were paper thin weatherboard, so there was no the heat was, if it was 100 degrees outside, it was 100 degrees inside, or maybe hotter.
No, it was hotter.
And then the possums would jump on the roof and
Hmm.
like slam on the roof, and so you'd be there half delirious, not sleeping because of the heat, and then there would be this crashing sound. It sounded like a body falling onto the roof. That was so
Or the
loud.
possums coming in, not in Harcourt Street, but in Kelvin Grove. You know, the possum coming into the bedroom in the middle of the night.
Yeah, we talked
Anyway,
about, I think we talked about that on another episode, but
yeah,
about you having to pick up that possum with a towel. But I remember one of the first nights we moved back there in 2002, and we were walking from New Farm and the Valley up to Spring Hill to go out for a
yeah, I
drink.
remember. I know. Yeah, I remember
And it
this.
was so hot. And I mean, it would have been over 30 degrees at night time, like 33 degrees.
Yeah,
And we had been drinking probably Jack Daniels and Coke. And
Bundy and Coke.
that part of Brisbane, if anyone's familiar with it, is very hilly. So there are lots of hills, and you've got to go up and down, up and down. And I can remember you were drunk.
Mostly just up. Like it's just up, up, up.
It never comes down again.
Hmm.
And you were drunk and like so hot, and we were walking up this hill, and you were stepping like a pigeon,
I was
and
I was zigzagging.
yeah, zigzagging, but one foot in front of the other, like almost like 2 inches in, like you were just stepping like 2 inches at a time, going
Hmm.
up and up and up, and it took us like an hour to do this
And I
15
think I
minute
was
walk.
wearing jeans. I think I was
Yeah.
so hot, and I was wearing jeans, and it was just I was sweating. I was sweating from places that I didn't even know I had pores. So
And yeah, but I can remember a time when I lived in West End with my friend Glenn in an apartment that obviously had no air conditioning. And I can remember there was a heat wave where I think for about a week it didn't go below 30 degrees at night. So for about a week solid. And so there
mhm.
was no release from the heat. And I can remember just not sleeping, just being
Yeah.
awake. And I also lived on the street that I lived on had a lot of trucks going down there because there was industry at the end of it. And so often through the night, you would hear like semi trailers and trucks going past anyway, which would keep me awake. And
Hmm.
so the only way I could sleep was closing the windows, but I couldn't close the windows because it was so hot. Oh, yeah, I've had some horrendous nights with the heat in Australia. What was Sydney like for you? Was the weather, it never really got that hot, did it?
Sydney, I mean, Sydney would have occasional bursts where it would get to sort of 42, 43. I remember one time when my first summer in Sydney in Barkham Avenue.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the novelty of it, I just was so sort of enthralled or thrilled by the novelty of it. But yeah, like I
Yeah.
remember, but then it was different because I think when we went back and lived in Sydney together, I think a few of those places did have aircon, didn't they? Like maybe the one in Redfern we
Yes.
lived in had aircon, and obviously I
Yeah.
was working in an office block which had aircon. So I don't know. I don't remember Sydney, and I think Sydney does get more breezes because it's obviously much closer to it's on the coast and it's on the huge harbour as well. So I think it does get more breezes, perhaps.
I have a real memory of being in Australia as a young child and always being cooked alive in cars, like always being hot in cars. Like growing up, like I was born in the 70s. So I don't remember there being good air conditioning in cars. I mean, that must be a modern phenomenon, right? To
Yeah, it
have,
is. It
and
is.
you would have air vents. So if you were traveling at speed, air would come through. But I
Hmm.
can remember, I always have memories of being stuck around where the Brisbane hospital is, the
Hmm.
near the what part of the city is that?
Like
Hurston.
yeah, and where the Echo is.
And I can remember always being stuck in traffic jams there and being just hot, like it being 36, 37 degrees, not moving, no breeze, people all stuck in traffic, sticking their bare feet out the windows, like a real Brisbane, like drongo white
Uh
trash
huh.
thing to do.
Uh
And
huh.
I can remember once the radiator in the car I was traveling in as a child, like overheated, and we were stopped in traffic, and it was just a nightmare. And then the the story behind when I decided to stop eating animals is also related to being stuck in a traffic jam and
Mm.
being hot. But that was in Sydney on that road that went back in from sort of Parramatta back into the
Yeah.
inner city. And I can remember
Yeah.
being stuck in a traffic jam with Vanessa and Stephen, and it being so incredibly hot, and seeing all these poor chickens in this
Mm.
truck next to us, and it was excruciating, and the smell coming from it was disgusting. And I thought, oh, if I ate chicken, that's probably my dinner there. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't do this. And that's what,
Mm.
made me. But like, I really associate being stuck in traffic jams and heat waves with Australia.
Yeah. Do you remember that time we were driving? Remember that big station wagon we had, and we were driving up to Mount Morgan? I mean, this is a whole nother episode of our lives, but and we hadn't gotten far out of Brisbane. We hadn't even made it up to like the Sunshine Coast yet, and that there was that explosion in the engine, and something exploded in the front engine of the car, and it made a dent in the bonnet, and we had to pull over. It was like not Mary. We hadn't even got to Maryborough. I can't remember where we were, but it was like Sunshine Coast hinterland somewhere on that motorway. And yeah, we had to, I don't know if it was a radiator. I don't know anything about cars. They're a complete mystery to me.
Talking about me romanticizing like Brisbane or Queensland, isn't Queensland just the wildest place? With
In
like,
what way?
well, the people, the culture, I mean, it's beautiful, like the beautiful beaches and bushland and scenery. The weather is usually stunning, but when you pull into these towns like Maryborough or Kilcoy, and it's just
Yeah.
they're just like from another era or
What's
time.
the slogan? Queensland, beautiful one day, perfect the next, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the weather is generally really good, but yeah, I think Queensland, yeah, Queensland is, and it's got a bit of a reputation as well, hasn't it? I was actually listening to a gardening podcast this morning, and it was an interview with a woman in Melbourne, and she's a landscape designer.
Hmm.
And she even said in the podcast, that she works a lot with native plants and trying to create more wildlife habitat, even in urban gardens and
Yeah.
urban landscapes.
Hmm.
And she said that she started to work in other states, but she said Queensland does seem to be very much behind the rest of the world, even in
Yeah.
landscape architecture or landscape
What would
design.
that look like to be behind the times in landscape architecture?
Well,
How would you not be?
I think the implication in this podcast was that she was saying that people in Queensland, or whether that's individuals or collectively like landscape architecture firms and stuff like that, are just not as on board in creating native wildlife havens in their designs, and that it was a much harder thing to try and sell to designers and urban planners in Queensland.
I mean, what do they want in Queensland? Do they want rose gardens and things like that?
I don't I don't necessarily think it's that. I just think it's very sort of pedestrian. It's not very progressive. And I mean, that was my experience at Brisbane as well, and Queensland. And do you remember when I worked at the University of Sydney, and I worked with I'm not going to name names because I know in last week's episode you were very critical of my flagrant disregard of people's privacy.
Doxy.
But yeah, and anyway, I worked with a guy who was quite well known in his field, and he was of Chinese heritage. And he had been born and raised in Australia, and he said he would travel all over the world and deliver speeches at conferences and seminars and whatever, symposiums. And he said no one ever asked him about his background except when he went to Brisbane.
Hmm.
And he said without fail, every time he would go and present in Brisbane, someone would come up to him afterwards and say, "My God, where did you learn to speak such good English?" And I was like,
So
yeah,
bad.
that sounds like the Brisbane I know. So apologies, I know we have some viewers in Brisbane and Queensland, but
Well, we
yeah.
don't need to apologize for calling out what it is. I mean, it is what it is. I'm from there. I know it. When, like, I'm sure we've told this story, but I think it bears repeating about when we went to see Margaret Cho
Oh my God,
in
yeah.
concert in Brisbane. And Margaret Cho is a comedian, and she had an opening act called
Oh, what was
Bruce.
his?
Was it Bruce? Someone?
Yeah, it was Bruce. Anyway, he was
I've never heard of him again since then.
no, what was his name?
And
Anyway,
he
sorry, you
he
can tell the story.
he was. an African American man. Well, I believe that's how he identified, as African American. Or I'm not
Hmm.
sure if his ancestry or heritage was from the Caribbean or wherever, but he had a North American accent and he identified as African American. But his skin was a bit lighter in tone. And when he was telling jokes, like about racism and just doing a comedy routine as the
Hmm.
opener for Margaret Cho.
Hmm.
He was a couple of jokes into his set, and somebody about 8 rows back in the crowd at this show in Brisbane shouted out, "Was it what are you?
What are you, black or white?
What are
I,
you, black or white?" And he was like, "Sorry, what do you mean?" He goes, "What are you, black or white?" And the guy goes, "Well, if you're referring to my race, I'm black." He goes, "Well, that's what I thought because you keep making jokes about being black, but you look white to me." And everybody was so shocked and just, I think
so
Michelle
awful.
was with us, wasn't she?
Oh, maybe, yeah, yeah.
And my sister Michelle. And everyone, and the performer was so shocked. Like everybody in the room was stunned into silence. And the
Hmm.
performer didn't know what to say. He said, "I just don't know what to say to that. Like, this
Yeah,
is,"
yeah,
and it was so bizarre. But that's the kind of thing. And what year would that have been? About 20 years ago?
yeah, yeah. I would say 20. I mean,
And I've been talking a lot about Brisbane lately in talks that I've been given about where I'm from, and I went to be the guest speaker the other night at the Jewish vegan. The group is called Jewish Vegan Sustainable, and they invited me in to talk about my work as an activist, my community organizing, and the work I do with Made in Hackney.
hmm.
But as it was a general talk, I had to talk about where I was from. And I always try and give a little insight to people about, well, it was quite an oppressive place to grow up, and that has that knock on effect for people now. So it was illegal to be gay, up in like homosexuality was decriminalized in 1991. So that the effects of that still exist today. It was an extremely racist place. It had a violent and corrupt police force that was extremely racist and violent towards black people, especially Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander young men. And I said, all of this stuff informs how I feel about social justice. And I said, when you grow up in a place like that, you can either you can go 3 ways. You can go sort of the path, the sort of lefty path that I've gone of trying to redress disadvantage and oppression and that sort of thing. You can go the other way and become like a total redneck and fall into that. Oh, well, I'm going to get away with this because all of these structures exist for me to get away with it. Or you
Mm.
just float around in the middle, which is most of what Australians do, is just act indifferent and that it's nothing to do with you.
But also, not I'm not excusing any form of hatred or discrimination, but I also feel a bit sorry for a lot of Australians of maybe not so much anymore, but in previous generations who grew up in such a monoculture. They grew up in such with such a lack of diversity, or at least any visible diversity, in their communities that it doesn't excuse it, but you can certainly understand how it ends up, or it did end up being such a racist, homophobic, place or society. And you would get people like, Tony Abbott being prime minister, like just horrible. Anyway, yeah,
That 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 idea, like the Australia is also steeped in racism because of privilege. So it is an incredibly wealthy country, and
mm,
it's a wealthy country because it carried out and continues to carry out a genocide against the people that were there before white people
yeah,
got there,
they
only
declared
just
it.
over 200 years ago. So
Mm.
that's going to inform the way that the power structures and dynamics of society are set up.
Oh,
But
completely.
when we started this, we cut into this conversation. People might have heard us trailing off talking about shirts,
Oh yeah.
and I was saying that it's kind of weird. If you go back and watch some of the episodes, we kind of match not like the same color and stuff, but like today we both got like collared shirts that are buttoned up, and another time we both had like black band t-shirts on.
Mm-hmm.
I think, or like I was wearing like the Black Heart pub one, and you were wearing a Magic Dirt one,
Mm-hmm.
and how is that? Are we in sync with?
Maybe. I mean, I think it. I think my choice of shirt this morning was informed by the weather. You know, I knew that it was a hot, very sunny day, and I thought I probably should wear something with a collar so that when I'm out and about, you know, I'm not going to get burned. And I mean, that is a real hangover from having lived in Australia,
Yeah,
like constantly being really very sort of mindful about sun exposure.
and what
And
about
so
demure?
not so much demure, just mindful. And yeah, slip slop slap. There's a so the Australia loves Australian public health messaging loves like really cheesy, corny, um, catchy,
Jingles or
um,
slogans?
yeah. And so like for sun exposure, they say slip slop slap. So it's slip on a t-shirt, slop on some sunblock, and slap on a hat.
Uh-huh.
And in cars, like to encourage people to wear their seatbelts, it would be like click clack front and back. And then there's a really awful one as well. Apologies for if this causes any offence, but for drink driving, they had one, and it was drink. I have to do it in an Australian accent. It was drink drive, brake late, dead mate.
Break late.
Drink drive, brake late, dead mate. As in,
Uh,
you know, if you're drinking, your response times are slower, so you don't brake in time, and then you're dead.
wow.
So yeah, charming. Anyway, yeah. So I don't know what informed your choice of shirt today.
I don't know. I looked and I suppose because it's a light cotton as well, but my
Mm,
t-shirts are a bit thicker. So I thought, oh, if I went for a walk before and I was like, oh, if I go for a walk, it'll be nice. I can roll the sleeves up. I can,
mm.
I don't really worry about getting burnt in London. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, you're not gonna get burnt like, as in like, really, really badly burnt like you would in Australia. But yeah, maybe in
Okay.
August, perhaps in like the height of summer, you might. But yeah.
Would it be similar to how we're wearing the same thing, like that urban legend about or urban myth about people who have their period go on the same cycle if they live or travel together? You
Oh,
know
you
that
think that's
uh,
it with the?
urban legend, where maybe this is our version of being on the same period cycle.
Mm-hmm. We're aligned.
Yeah, and talking about that, notice how I said people who have their period and
Mm-hmm.
not women, and it kind of leads us into one of the things we wanted to talk about this week,
Mm-hmm.
which is, well, it's a very contentious subject. It doesn't need to be, but it is at the moment around gender, biological sex, identity, and the legal ramifications of what's happened in the UK High Court. I mean, what do you want to say about it? Do you want to give anyone any background or?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think partly it's important to note that you know we should be listening to trans people's lived experience and trans people's um, uh, response to the policy and to the High Court ruling. But that said, I think both of us are members of the queer community, and both of us are very concerned about what's happened. So, the
Okay.
Supreme Court, the week before last, the Supreme Court in England and Wales, no, sorry, in England, Scotland and Wales. I don't think Northern Ireland. I think that is separate. They ruled that under the Equality Act, the definition of the term woman is only applies to people who were born female, who are the assigned the gender of female at birth, and so it has
So
had.
So the
Sorry,
ruling
go on.
means like I've just got this little bit here I wrote down because it's very easy to get things wrong. And I find when you're talking about this stuff, if you get a like, not only is it irresponsible to get details wrong, but have you found that transphobic people really nitpick over details? And if you slightly say the wrong thing, like
Hmm.
basically our argument is don't be a prick to people and leave people alone. But if
Hmm.
you're talking about terminology around this, people are very pedantic all of a sudden and they
Yeah,
want to catch
yeah,
you out.
yeah.
The ruling means that transgender women, so even those with a gender recognition certificate, that's known here as a GRC, are not legally recognized as women in certain contexts, particularly regarding single sex spaces and equality measures. So while the court affirmed that transgender individuals are still protected under the characteristics of gender reassignment in the Equality Act, this ruling has significant implications for the rights and daily lives of trans people in the UK. I mean, have you got any thoughts on this ruling? And also, oh, by the way, if anyone wants to look this up, the court case was For Women Scotland Limited was the organisation, the grassroots organisation that brought the lawsuit, versus the Scottish ministers. That's the law, the case.
Mm-hmm.
Have you got any thoughts, initial thoughts on the potential harms that this ruling causes or could cause to trans people?
Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts. I mean, first of all, it's outrageous that trans women would, under this interpretation of the law, that trans women would have to use a bathroom that's for men. You know, that is essentially, and vice versa, trans men would have to use a women's bathroom.
Well, did the
And
ruling say anything about trans men, or was the ruling all about women?
well, this is it, and this is the problem with it. It would the case was brought by a turf feminist group, For Women Scotland, partly funded, we should note, by J.K. Rowling.
Do you know how much money she gave them?
I think it was £70,000.
That's what's been reported. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more, but it was reported to be 70,000, and they must have had money from other awful people as well.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like it centers around this notion, this trope, if you like, of women feeling unsafe in bathrooms because they think that men could disguise themselves as women and attack them in there. And so I think, first of all, it's important, obviously, to note Sean and I are both cis men. So there is an element to the debate or the discussion to say that, we have feelings and thoughts and concerns, but we're not women. We were not assigned that gender at birth. And so I think we have to listen to women's concerns, definitely. But I obviously don't agree with the outcome. And I think there's a much more nuanced discussion to be had. But what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I think it's wildly incorrect ruling, like unjust ruling, like wildly. Like, I don't think it's like, oh yeah, not a big deal. I think it's outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's incredibly upsetting. I think the potential harms to trans people are already happening. I think the potential harm to non-trans women is also happening. I think women who don't prescribe or look a certain way or expectation of what a gender representation might be for some people. Like, there was a woman on the news the other day saying that staff in a supermarket asked her to leave the women's toilet because, I mean, her self-identifying as a butch lesbian, so she looked a certain way with short hair, but she was assigned female at birth. She identifies as a woman. She is, by all metrics, a cisgendered woman. Was confronted and asked to leave the toilets because they thought that she was a trans woman or a man. And the policing of this and this slapdash sort of ruling is not considering the nuance and the wild variance in human reality. I mean, people are not men and women, and then that's it. Another thing, that it completely erases or discounts intersex people, which is not an insignificant proportion of the population. And also, I have fears and concerns. Sorry, you go.
Well, no, I was just going to say, it's not an insignificant portion of the population. But the other thing I was going to say, sort of, a minute ago, was that, when we talk about trans people and when trans people are used as a political football, which is exactly what is happening here, it's so easy to slip under this false impression that it's a lot of people. It's not. Trans people make up a very, very small percentage, and in some ways that shouldn't even matter.
No, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter if it was one person
but what I'm saying is
people.
that the amount of news coverage and attention that such a relatively tiny amount of people
Yeah.
receive just shows how much it's just being completely politicized and used um, as a uh, well, people are trying to encapsulate so many other things within this trans debate, and it's really unfair. It's really
Yeah.
grossly unfair and
And
misguided.
and some of my other concerns are for the safety of trans people in other spaces such as hospital wards,
Yep.
because they're often isolated into either separated into either men or women, male
Hmm.
or female. And if a hospital is allowed by law to deny a trans woman patient access to the women's ward or women's services or safe
Hmm.
spaces in a
Hmm.
hospital, that
Hmm.
could be extremely dangerous. And like, we're not even talking about the mental anguish of an
Oh
individual
no, we're
going
just talking
through
about
that.
physical safety.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Also things like shelters, like women's shelters.
yeah,
And we know that trans women have a higher likelihood of needing to access safe spaces like shelters or
yep.
doctors' services or health services,
Well,
safe spaces
this is
like,
it. Like trans women are subject to all of the misogyny that society puts on women, but then they are subjected to an additional layer of discrimination and hatred for
yeah,
being trans.
yeah,
And yeah, um it's so I just struggle to even find the words like evil. It doesn't really it is not the word I want. It's not the word I'm looking for, but it's
yeah,
so horrific
yeah,
to target a group of individuals who are already the target of such hatred. And it completely ignores, I think, the bigger picture. It completely ignores the real problem, and that is male sexual violence.
yeah,
When women talk about um, the need to feel safe in a bathroom, in a women's shelter, well, of course, yeah. I mean, that's a given. They of course should be safe spaces. However, the argument that they have to ban trans women because there's a risk of a male sexual predator dressing up as a woman and invading these spaces, you know, that I think possibly, and I don't have statistics, and I don't think there are very good, reliable statistics available, but I don't think that happens that much. I think it's a phenomenon that has been sensationalized by the media and by some political groups.
yeah.
But
And it's
even it,
it's that trope in Hollywood movies or TV shows like Law and Order, where or Silence of the Lambs, that
Mhm,
sort of thing, where it's somebody who's a cross dresser
mhm,
and they'll go in and they'll have a sick fetishization of women, and they're not even really like trans identifying. They're like
no,
perverted and sick, and they're like a serial killer or something.
yeah,
That's that whole idea of that.
yeah,
And it really just will lead to more isolation and vulnerability
mm,
and like marginalization of a part of the community that is already marginalized. And
yeah.
trans women experience more incidences of sexual violence and physical violence than cis women, and they need more protection, not less.
Hmm. But the thing is, it's just all of this argument, all of this press, all it does is ignore the real problem, and that is that yes, women should feel safe and not be subject to sexual violence, which is by and large committed by cis men, and that's the
Yeah,
problem we should be addressing, and that is the
yeah,
problem we should be building policy around and having
yeah,
court rulings around. And it's not, and it's just it makes me so angry and so sad to think that um, that and I don't know J.K. Rowling personally, but I just fucking despise her gloating, social media post on the
yeah,
day of the ruling, sitting on her yacht with a cigar, saying, "I love it when a plan comes together." I mean, fuck you, fuck you, J.K. Rowling. I think it's absolutely in such poor taste to celebrate that Supreme Court
well,
ruling
I don't
at
even think
the
it's a poor taste is strong enough. I think it's an act of violence. I think
yeah.
it is trying to embolden people who are transphobic by saying, yeah, look, we've had a victory.
But it's not
you
a
know,
victory for women. That's the thing. It's not a
no,
victory for women
no.
because the real threat of male sexual violence still exists for everyone, cis women and for trans women.
And if
And
anything, it's giving a sort of a veil or a smoke screen of secrecy or protection to men by shifting the blame
yeah,
to
completely.
another
Completely.
part of society instead of saying, hey, like
Yeah.
go back over the last 2 weeks since the ruling and have a look at all news reports about women that were harmed and see who did it. See
Yeah.
who perpetuated those acts of violence against women.
Yeah. I
And
mean, there was just like a couple of days ago, there was that horrible misogynistic attack in Leeds. You know, some guy, some radicalized, man went on an attack in Leeds with a crossbow, and it's like that doesn't get half as much press as this Supreme
no.
Court ruling, and it maddens me.
Also, like I also have concerns around employment discrimination
Hmm.
and the protections around that being eroded by this ruling, or workplaces citing this judgment or this ruling to discriminate against trans people in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they might say a trans woman doesn't have the same protections as women in the workplace. They might
Yeah.
not have access to certain types of employee sponsored healthcare or mental health um, facilities. They might be less in line for promotions if that workplace has diversity quotas around
Mm-hmm.
giving minorities preference, and so they
Yeah.
might not have to recognize trans people as
Yeah.
women for promotion. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a problem with that. Also,
And
I think that there's a general erosion of legal protection, and this is the start of it. So
mm,
there's a very slippery slope. If you start to take this protection away from trans women, I mean, we are talking about trans women here because that seems to be the brunt of what's going on, or like the
yeah.
focal point for
Yeah.
people. What's next? What other things will be taken away? Will people now start to campaign for the gender recognition certificates to be taken away?
Mm. But the thing that just I find so upsetting and so enraging about it is that if the basis, or if these groups like For Women Scotland, if they recognise, as I'm sure they would, that women are subject to more assaults than men, and if they recognise that the majority of perpetrators of that are cis men,
Hmm.
and that is the foundation for them not wanting trans women in their bathroom, that is there's such a blatant disregard for the lives of trans women.
Yes.
Where are they supposed to go? You want to send trans women into men's toilets
Yep.
where where they are
Yeah.
much more likely to be attacked, or whether that's verbal or physical or sexual
Yeah.
assault. That's much more likely to happen if trans women have to go into men's toilets. And also, I mean, it's not meant to be a trivialization of it or anything, but like that also means that trans men have to use women's toilets, and there are lots of very, very masculine, butch-looking trans men out there, and
Yep.
so that's not going to make women feel safer if they have trans men going into their bathrooms. It's just an absurd, such
But
short-sighted.
it also starts to lead to sort of this vigilante justice of people
Oh
who
yeah.
aren't qualified to do so, policing other people's biological sex, gender expression,
Yeah.
self-identity. It
Yeah.
starts to police, and so like what I was saying, like some cis women are finding themselves being confronted by these do-gooder vigilantes who are
Mm.
like, you shouldn't be in this toilet.
There
Um,
was that boxer last year. That was she, an American boxer, and she
was
is,
she Iranian,
oh, maybe
maybe?
she was Iranian actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, perhaps you're right. And she presents as very masculine, and there were all sorts of, her gender identity or her chromosomes were called into question because people said, oh, it's not fair if she's a trans
Yeah.
woman. And this is, the whole trans people in sports debate is also sort of brought into this, although not in terms so much of the High Court rule or Supreme Court ruling,
Yeah.
but I think the whole debate around trans people in sport also, again, fails to look at the real problem. And that is that to have people, I think we've talked about it on the podcast before, haven't we? Like to have people competing against each other in sports. Why is that separated by gender? I mean, gender is not a useful
Well,
definition, separation of height, weight, strength, ability, dexterity. I mean, it's.
there is generally a scientific understanding that biological male bodies do have an advantage in certain ways, in certain things when you're measuring success like that. But
Hmm,
yeah, I mean, I'm not one for celebrating things like the Olympics anyway, because I mean, it's so problematic in so many other ways. I mean, we can, or like organized sport is so problematic anyway. There's a whole other thing of that, and all through history, there have been people who were assigned female or male at birth who have then gone to live their lives, um, like in the opposite of that binary
hmm,
because that's what they felt. And then their societies accepted that and they lived their lives. And some of them were sports people, some of
hmm,
them were actors, some of them were doctors, some of them were, and this is going back as far as human records go back.
hmm.
There is incident of this. Sports is just such a nonsense argument to me because it is just so problematic anyway, organized sport. And
Well, I mean, I think most sports, of course, neither of us are experts in anything really, but except plants and Lady Gaga.
uh-huh.
But I think most sports do relate back more or less to Roman games. Where it was people literally fighting to stay alive and competing to stay alive, and so over centuries, of course, that's been modified
Yeah.
and commercialized. But yeah, I think a lot of sports are in their very essence should be looked at and questioned rather than the gender of the people competing. I mean, that's I think, and again, it's missing the bigger picture. It's ignoring the real problem, much in the same way that the toilet ban ignores the larger and more important problem of male sexual violence in society,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also the inadequate bathroom facilities that exist in most cultures, that
Yeah.
it is that, serious things can happen in toilets because they are so shielded from view and they are such, by their very nature, they provide a lot of privacy, but with that privacy, of
Yeah.
course, comes risk. And so that's probably the bigger problem. Um, and going back to like intersex people, because you
Hmm.
did mention them before, and yeah, I mean, trans people are a relatively small percentage of the population of the world, and intersex people are an even smaller percentage of the population of the world, I believe. I mean, I don't think there are that many official numbers on intersex people because I think even birth records are not a reliable source of data
Well, do you
for that.
know what happens when somebody is born intersex? In the UK, this is, I'm not really talking, I don't know what goes on in other parts of the world, but I'm sure it
Mm-hmm.
would be similar.
Mm-hmm.
An assessment is made.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not um, clear what genitalia is the most prevalent,
Mm-hmm.
or what other markers, physical markers of
Mm-hmm.
biological sex are the strongest or most pronounced,
Mm-hmm.
a team comes in of the hospital. I don't think the parents are involved, and they make an assessment and they make a decision on the biological sex determination. And so they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, this person is male, and it's
Yeah.
then marked on their birth certificate as male.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is the thing that makes that person have to live the rest of their life as a man because
Mm-hmm.
they've been designated male, or
Mm-hmm.
as a female, as a woman because they've been designated female.
Yeah.
And so if you're an intersex person, and it's very complex about like the emotions and the lived reality for intersex people. If you grow up and then you say, well, actually, what I was assigned doesn't suit my gender expression or how I feel I want to exist or need to exist in this world,
Mm-hmm.
you then have to be labeled as a trans person, to transgender, to swap that or to live the truth that you feel. Or if you don't want to be either male or female or man or woman,
Mm-hmm.
because that's how you were born,
Mm-hmm.
there's no place for you in the law to recognize that.
Yeah.
It's
But
it's
but
wild.
the the reason why I think intersex people get sort of dragged into the trans debate so much is because they are a very real physical, not manifestation, but they're a real life, flesh and bone example of the fact that gender is not binary. And so,
Yeah, but you're saying gender. We're intersex is about biological sex.
no, and exactly that's what I'm saying. So, like, then the reason they get dragged into this trans debate is because you cannot operate a law, you cannot apply a law on a gender binary because that what's the word? It
But the
ignores.
but sorry, you're just saying gender again. The law is about biological binary. So
Right.
the law is about male and female, but
Mm-hmm.
they're taking the term woman, which is related to gender. They're
Mm-hmm.
taking that and they're making the law be that that word and term is now attached to a binary biological sex as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you gender is not a binary and neither is biological sex, but this
Right.
ruling is saying that it is.
Right. That's what I mean. That's like you're trying to rewrite the laws of biology
Yeah,
through the law of a country.
yeah,
And unfortunately that, if even if you were anti-trans and were like, yes, that's how it should be, there it's a binary, that discounts a portion of the population because
yes, yeah,
there are some people who are neither, or they are
yes,
both,
yeah.
or and it just, and that's why I think they get sort of dragged into the conversation so much. um
But
but
also, I feel that people who are fighting for the rights of trans people should also be mindful and considerate of intersex people and their lived reality. Because, I mean,
mhm,
if these laws are horrible and discriminatory against trans people, how do intersex people feel? Like
yeah,
how there aren't even laws that govern what you should do with your body or
yeah,
your gender expression as an intersex.
yeah,
Or, and for some intersex people, their gender expression would be non-binary. That's how
mhm,
they identify. For some intersex people, their gender expression would be woman
mhm,
or man.
mhm,
For some intersex people, they feel their gender expression shifts around,
yep,
and so all of these rulings are about constraining and controlling people and making people feel like shit and making spaces less welcoming and pushing people out from society, marginalizing people.
mm,
So it's
yeah.
marginalizing intersex people, it's marginalizing trans people.
It's demonizing and targeting people who are not a threat generally. I mean, no more or less so than anyone else in society.
No.
And that,
And then once again, it's also putting cis women in more dangerous situations. And there are opportunities to harass women about their appearance. And the misogyny is a big part of this. And
yep.
the expectation that women should look a certain way and perform a certain way and act a certain way. It's all
Mm,
tied into that.
hmm.
And uh, I don't know what's going to happen here. There is a ruling sorry, there is I think an ex-judge who might be a trans woman who is trying to challenge the decision, is trying to
Yeah,
start a legal.
I think she is still a working High Court judge.
Oh, is she?
And she's launched a challenge to the Supreme Court ruling. And she said it did not consult enough on all of the communities affected by the ruling or by the challenge that was brought by Four Women Scotland. That it did not consult with enough people in the community. Um, and yeah, I don't think this will be the last of it. But I don't, I have to let me think what I'm trying to say here. Of course, I don't know J.K. Rowling's personal history. I believe she may have been the victim of a violent sexual assault in
I
her
have
past.
no memory or
I don't
history of
know if
knowledge
that,
of that.
I don't know if that's something I've heard or read or just made up in my head. I don't know, but whether she has or hasn't, of course, I'm sympathetic to anybody who's been a victim of assault like that. But I do think we need to really, um, we need to look at the root cause of such things, and that's, we've talked about it in the past here on when we did the episode about adolescence. That's male sexual violence or male violence, whether it's sexual or not, is really the root cause of this ban. That's the
Hmm.
problem there, and this completely ignores the issue.
Yeah.
Um, it just, yeah, I don't know.
Well, what happened recently as well with the ruling about denying trans people access to medical and um, mental interventions or help, especially with denying young trans people access to
To
hormone
hormone
blockers.
blockers, yeah.
See, that was a step, and then in this direction. And then the warnings were, hey, this is just the first step. And everyone's saying, no, no, it's just about protecting children. It's just about,
Hmm.
doing the right thing by children. Nothing, no one's, anyone who's an adult who's made their own mind up, nothing's going to happen to them.
Yeah,
And now here we are a year later, and
yeah.
this shit is happening. These things are a fucking floodgate opening, and they're
Hmm.
chipping away. And this is the erosion of legal protection for trans people. And it's happening. It's
Hmm.
happening right now in front of our eyes. And
Yeah. And I mean, you and I are both in a sort of, we're of a generation, we're Generation X, and we were sort of, we grew up, or we sort of, our formative period was in a weird sort of time between two extremes. And so the generation before grew up in a much more homophobic, much more closed society where gay people, queer people were couldn't really be open. They were very much demonized by society
mhm,
and by the media and by laws. And then we've sort of come to this period in our lives, especially in the UK, where queer existence is celebrated a lot more than it was, where, we can live our lives in a much more open way. And but the echoes of history were still very, very strong in our minds, particularly for you growing up in a place where homosexuality wasn't decriminalized until the 90s.
yeah,
But that those echoes of history were still so strong in our minds growing up that we know full well that during the 80s, during the AIDS pandemic, um, queer people, gay men particularly, were very much demonized and targeted by the media. And it was that same sort of social, what's the word, like social exclusion.
yeah,
Like if somebody looked like, I mean, obviously, this is in inverted commas if you're listening to this on Spotify, but, if somebody presented as like they might have AIDS, then
mhm,
they would be, refused service. They would be shooed out of public spaces and
yeah.
refused service at restaurants and shops and stuff like that. And so it feels very much like this is just a repetition of that, but this time it's trans people that
And
are.
I listened to that podcast that you recommended listening to, the series by Making Gay History
Yeah.
podcast about queer people and the Nazis.
Hmm.
And you listen to that, and it's highly distressing. The stories. Did you listen to the entire series?
Oh yeah, yeah. I cried multiple times.
And it's very distressing. But when I went to talk to the Legal Vegan Network, I mentioned that podcast, and I said, like, it's not that unlikely that this stuff would happen again. We are starting to see the erosion of the rights of people's rights, queer people's rights, that would have been at the start of the Nazis' reign. Like they would have started doing things like, they did. They started picking on trans people and locking
Hmm.
them up or denying them services or denying Jewish people things
Yeah,
or like making people stay in certain areas, controlling what spaces people could go into.
yeah,
That's where
yeah.
it started. And so, people think, oh, well, you shouldn't compare, where you live now to Nazi. It's not the same. Well, it is the fucking same thing. Like it's the start of this systematic oppression of a group of people. It's starting, you
I,
know?
yes and no. I think it's I there is I think there is some use in comparing the two situations, but I do think at the same time it's it's not a direct comparison and it's not exactly the same. But yes, in terms of like just basic human rights being dissolved and for sectors of society being demonized and targeted, yes, but
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't think we're at a place where um where trans people are going to be rounded up and sent to concentration camps, but it certainly is going to
Well,
change a lot of public acceptance or public opinion.
well,
And
hang on a sec. How about people in the US being rounded up and sent to prison in another country who,
mhm,
regardless of who they are and what reason they might have or have not to go there, it's
mhm,
happening in another developed country or
mhm,
an advanced country. It's happening in the US. People, maybe not because they're trans, but for other reasons, are being put in maximum security prisons in dangerous situations, just taken, snatched off the street. I mean,
yeah,
it's so fucking ludicrous that people try and act like that, like when we listen to what Nazis did, is somehow history. When you've got actually, we sell arms, weapons to countries that kill thousands of people and oppress people. Our tax dollars go and do that. So what happened in the war with Nazis, we're participants in that happening now in other parts of the world. It might not be happening on the streets of London, but it's happening with our tax dollars.
mhm,
Um, our government supports like the state of Israel, which is uh, carrying out a genocide in Gaza and in Palestine.
mhm,
What the US, where you have family and where we have holidayed over years, they are snatching people off the street and sending them to prisons. They kept people in Guantanamo Bay for decades. Like
mhm,
this is this is comparable to uh, what these forms of oppression that we hear about in the history book. It's happening,
mhm,
and these things, these little chipping away at like trans rights, are a part of this broader system of oppression that is happening all over the globe by capitalist and usually white supremacist forces. And it's
mhm,
fucked up, and it's so incredibly distressing.
mhm. Yeah, I don't, I'm just very cautious around any sort of comparison to the Holocaust because it's been used by many causes. I think we've talked about here in the past how Morrissey used to draw comparisons between the animal slaughter or the farming
Yeah,
industry and the Holocaust, and I find that problematic. I think in the same way that people talk about the Jim Crow era and slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and they compare modern scenarios to that. And again, I think it's a little bit lazy, or a little bit, well, not a little bit. It's quite offensive sometimes.
well, I don't mean that what's happening to trans people is in the UK is equivalent to the whole of the Holocaust. That's not what I said.
Well, that's. But
I'm
no, I know, but that's why I say you've got to
Yeah,
be really, I think,
I'm
careful
saying
with.
that at the start of the Third Reich, they started to
Yeah,
deny people access to healthcare
yeah.
based on their Jewishness or their transness or their queerness.
Or
They
their
started,
physical ability, or yeah.
yeah, or like they denied them movement. They denied them access to laws that other people
Hmm.
had. They
Yeah,
wouldn't let them shop in certain shops. They wouldn't let them use certain toilets.
yeah.
Similar to what happened, um, what people had to fight, the freedom riders and stuff had to fight for in the US around the emancipation of black people, like to use toilets or diners. You know,
Hmm.
yeah, these things aren't the same thing, and
Hmm.
you know, like the Holocaust was immeasurably um, like destructive. But what I'm saying is that these things start this way. They start by just chipping away or going after what is seen
Yeah,
as
they.
the weakest people in society or the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and they. That a lot of modern political rhetoric and discourse does really borrow from that. It doesn't rhyme perfectly, but it's it echoes it in it's talking about how these people, this section of society, especially in the US at the moment, and the discourse around immigrants, and it just demonizes people and says they're the problem, they're the scourge in society. They are the reason why you can't afford to do this or do that. It blames all of society's ills on
Hmm.
one section of society or one small section of society.
Yeah.
And that seems to be modern political discourse. And I don't know what's more upsetting, the people that disseminate it or the people that believe it. I just, it fills me with despair.
Yeah. And I mean, what can we do as trans allies in this current climate? Like, what can we do?
Well, yeah, it's hard to know sometimes. It feels overwhelming. I think the thing you always have to do is just sort of take each day as it comes and try and combat any examples of transphobia. Try, write to your MP, go on demonstrations, go and show up for your trans community. I think there's it can feel very much like there's overwhelming public support for this legislation, but I don't actually think there is. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I think a lot of people, I would say maybe 50% of the population don't really understand the nuance or the real issues around trans existence and trans identities.
And
And I
and
think,
I suppose what's really important is to listen to trans people, right?
yeah.
Like platform trans people when you can, trans voices,
Hmm.
listen to about lived experiences, and and be an ally. Like stand up and if you hear transphobic stuff at work or in your family or in your friends group, challenge people on it. And it don't, you know, if you don't feel comfortable like having a full blown argument, just say, oh, that doesn't sound right to me, or that
Mm,
doesn't sound very compassionate to me. Like it can be as
mm,
simple as that. One thing I did, like with our in our job at work, when we have our team meeting online once every 2 weeks, we all take turns of being the chair, where we say, "Okay, I'm in charge this week," and we
mm,
have this thing we do where we have an icebreaker. And so this week I was the chair, and my icebreaker was, I would like you to think about a trans person in your life that you know, who you would like to mention their name or celebrate them by mentioning them, and say why you've picked them.
mm,
And it was very simple, but it was just a way for a group of people to acknowledge the existence of a trans person in their life, to say
mm,
why they wanted to mention them or commemorate them or celebrate them,
mm,
and that was it. There wasn't like and now we've got to go over and like burn J.K. Rowling's house down, or now we've got to go and like challenge the High Court. It was just about being an ally in that space and
yeah.
saying, these are people, real people we know. This is why we like them or respect them, and that's it. And
Mm,
so we can just do that by recognizing trans people's general humanity and contributions to our
mm.
community. I mean, we all know trans people.
Yeah, and if I mean, I don't think everyone knows trans people, or I don't think that's necessarily the case for everyone. But I suppose
But
we're
do you
in
think people don't know they know? There might be that, like where people used to
possibly.
say, "I don't know any gay people," and it's like, well,
Mm,
you probably do
you do,
because
yeah, yeah, and that may be the
you
case.
probably do
But
because I just had sex with your husband down behind the toilets, you know. So you probably do know.
haha, no, but I mean, but my point being, they may not knowingly know trans people, but Um, I've lost my train of thought now. But that's right. I was going to say if anyone that does know trans people, even relatively well, they will know how much abuse
Hmm.
most trans people are subjected to on a daily basis, particularly in the world of social media, particularly on online stuff. But
And this is where it also gets problematic, is that trans people who look a certain way will get abuse.
mhm,
So, some like, and this is another thing where misogyny and appearance politics and policing come into it.
yeah,
If you're a trans woman who people think that they can tell you used to be a man,
mhm,
like they'll be subjected to more abuse. It's kind of like they need to be punished for not being feminine enough,
yeah.
and it's that sort of fuckery as well. Like that bizarre trans misogyny thing going on as well.
Yeah, and I mean this is it. That it all relates back to that same core issue, and that is that we've got to counter any form of violence. And I mean, we always seem to land back at that point, no matter what issue we're talking about, and that is that,
Yeah,
any form of violence, whether that's physical or verbal or
yeah,
emotional, we've got to address it at every level, because it all feeds from the same, the same beast, or the same source of origin,
yeah,
point of origin. Um, and we've got to counter it at in every manifestation. It's all related. It all links back. And we were talking, I think, I don't know, several months ago on the pod here about Peter, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and how
yeah,
you got into that whole thing with them about the horrible um, sexist discourse or stuff that they would use in their dissemination of animal rights material, and they
yeah,
thought that it was justified
yeah,
because animals needed protecting. And it's like, no, you've got to address violence at every level.
yeah.
So I don't know,
Well,
it's
I mean, maybe we can finish this. I'd like to give a shout out in commemoration to a trans woman who just died. Um, their drag performer name was Jiggly Caliente, and her name was Bianca Castro Abe. What was Arabejo, I think. Yeah, Castro Arabejo, Bianca. So Jiggly, as I was familiar with her, was a contestant on one of the early series of Drag Race. And Jiggly was Filipino American, born in the Philippines, and she was also went back to one of the All Stars series of Drag Race. She also had a recurring little sort of cameo spot in Pose, which I know you were a fan of.
hmm,
And very sadly, about 3 days ago, she passed away after an illness. And she was very young, and she brought a lot of joy to a lot of people around the world. She also was a guest judge on the Philippine version of Drag Race, like one of the regular panel judges on that for
mhm.
the first two seasons. And not that trans people who need to be celebrated need to be like world famous drag queens or anything, but I just it's very timely that it was only a few days ago that she passed, and
Hmm.
I just wanted to mention her and how
Yeah,
much I appreciated her art.
I think this is possibly another episode that we could do. But I do, as you know, as I've mentioned several times on this show, I don't watch Drag Race. I never have. Um, but we've mentioned a couple of times in this episode about how the notion of what it is to be a woman is very much linked to the whole trans debate and the forces of misogyny, and about societal expectations on women is very much linked to the trans debate, because in the sense that if a trans woman is so convincing, she's not going to be subjected to as much transphobia. And I think there's a whole discussion to be had around drag race as
Mm.
a phenomenon, because it's so interesting to me how drag race has become so successful, and there would be so many people around the world who watch drag race who don't have a good, a nuanced understanding of trans existences. And obviously, being trans is very different from being a drag queen, or a drag king. They're two separate things.
But they can
But
also coexist. There are a lot of trans
yes,
performers who are on
yeah,
trans race. that,
trans race.
that would
Maybe
be a
that's
good
the new
show.
new pitch. New
I'd watch
pitch.
that trans race.
But one of the
Fat gay vegans
issues.
trans race.
But one of the issues I have with Drag Race is that it only celebrates a very narrow. And obviously, I haven't watched it in years and years and years. I just stopped watching it. I think after the first season, when it wasn't even on mainstream TV. It was just on Wow. No, Wow,
No, it was before
not
that. It was
Wow. What was it called? Anyway,
Peacock or something. Yeah, it was on
yeah.
some.
But it falls into that whole, almost a binary, or it did then. It fell into that binary of, to be a drag queen, you had to be this type of presenting as a feminine woman. It
Yeah, well,
didn't.
they had in recent series, and one of the most popular queens to be on there is Got Mick, who is a trans man who does drag a lot of the time feminine presenting, but also non sort of gendered drag, and they were a finalist on their season, and they're one of the most popular drag performers to come from there. And so they're a trans man, and they talked about their trans masculinity on the show in the to camera pieces. There is a lot of trans women on the show. There are a lot of drag performers who've gone on there to say that drag has been a tool to help them process their trans identity. So it is still a very problematic show, but there has been a lot of progress since you would have watched it.
Well, yeah. I'm glad to hear that, but it's still not going to get me back in front of the screen watching it. But we should probably wrap up. Okay. We are going over a bit, I think, but it's been a serious episode. I was trying to think of something lighthearted to end on, but I don't think there is a sort of lighthearted summary in all of this. It's just that you've got to like.
Well, you could say you could finish with some words of wisdom by saying, no matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgender life, you're on the right track. Baby, you were born to survive.
Yeah. They always bring it back to a Gaga reference. I was trying to in my head while we were talking, I was trying to come up with like an Australian public health messaging type slogan, like around not fueling any more hatred, but I can't. So I'm just going to say like click clack front and back.
Don't be a drongo.
Yeah. Don't be a drongo, just be a queen. Anyway, let's not go into the Gaga references. Please do hit subscribe, and this is episode 42 or 43, so 42, we've got nearly a whole year's worth of episodes on there. So please do go back if you've just stumbled across this show. Please do go back and listen to or watch some of the old ones. My favorite, I think, was the the takedown of Jurassic World, and that's probably my favorite episode today.
I might try and share this episode when it comes out. You can find a TERF Reddit that I can share it to,
yeah,
so
do
we
that.
Get some hate watchers.
For Women's Scotland Facebook group, we're coming for you. Yeah, there's a light-hearted. What's that quote from The Simpsons? When Homer Simpson says, "Women will like what I tell them to like."
Yeah, when he invents the makeup gun.
Yeah. All right, let's end it on that. Check out all the show notes to find out what Sean and I are up to, and follow us and subscribe if you like what you've seen or heard today. And we will be back in your feeds this time next week. Until then, take care.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.